The Splatoon series is very heavily inspired by hip-hop. From the graffiti aesthetics to the fashion, there are several cultural references to hip-hop throughout the game, like Pharrell's famous Arby's hat look from the Grammys that showed up in one of the trailers for Splatoon 2, and Marina and Pearl's Biggie and Pac inspired looks in Octo expansion. The producer of Splatoon 2 was even asked about the Biggie and Pac reference in an interview with Game Informer and said, "We have members on our development team who are fans of hip hop music and hip hop culture. And it's people like that who feel that just like our real world we're living in, we can bring a variety of elements into the world of Splatoon and show people that it's not just a one note type of world." So all of this got me thinking about Japanese games and their relationship with hip hop, especially in contrast to how American games usually handle hip hop. Oftentimes with games and even anime, I've noticed that Japan has a particular way that they interpret hip hop, whether it be their continued appreciation for breakdancing culture or some of their slightly dated and sometimes endearing attempts at rap music.
Check it. I remember now. All the attacks, slashing and crash, always knocking me back.
Yeah, there seems to be a consistent way that Japan engages with hip hop, and I want to use Splatoon as sort of a jumping off point to discuss some of the reasons for why that is. So first, let's get into Japan's history with hip hop. As some of you may know, hip hop culture started in Bronx, New York around the 1970s, but several years after this movement started, it was also spreading to different parts of the world, not only in America, but in other countries too. For Japan, the exact year they were introduced to hip hop isn't super clear cut because there were actually several events that took place that helped bring the culture into the country. In 1983, the highly influential hip hop film Wildstyle premiered in Japan for the first time. The movie's title being a reference to the term Wildstyle, which was the colorful, abstract style of graffiti that still defines graffiti as an art form to this day. This movie told the story of a graffiti artist navigating New York's hip-hop scene while getting their art recognized. This film was a showcase of not only graffiti, but also the other major elements of hip-hop: graffiti, breakdancing, rapping, DJing, and the fifth element, depending on who you ask, knowledge of self. Very deep, very introspective. Some of hip-hop's early pioneers even came to Japan's premiere of the movie specifically to promote the film. This included Cold Crush, Fab Five Freddy, and Futura, and the effect of this movie's premiere were felt almost immediately. But interestingly enough, the aspect that resonated with Japanese viewers the most wasn't the rapping or DJing. It was actually the breakdancing and graffiti, and there's a reason why. In the book Hip Hop Japan by Ian Condry, which I'll be referencing a lot in this video, Japanese rapper Takagi Kan says, "I couldn't tell what was what with the rapping and DJing, but with the graffiti and breakdancing, I could understand it visually." This is also why for a long time Japanese hip-hop music had more old school sensibilities and did not evolve at the same rate as American hip-hop music. Because experiencing hip-hop through a language barrier outside of its original context meant that a lot of Japanese viewers mainly grabbed onto the more visual elements like breakdancing and graffiti since they couldn't necessarily understand what was being said in the raps. Another interesting thing to note too is that American breakdancing pioneer Crazy Legs cites karate films as being an inspiration for developing some of the breakdancing moves that we see today. So you can almost say there's like a spiritual connection that Japanese audiences may have felt that made them gravitate more towards certain aspects of hip-hop over others. One more thing I want to note when it comes to what aspects of hip-hop Japan gravitated more to. The Japanese language actually doesn't allow for dynamic rhyme schemes in the same way that English does. Like their words using fewer sounds and some of the grammatical restrictions that they have, like having to end sentences in auxiliary verbs like daio. I don't know the Japanese language super well, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this point, but from what I understand, having to end sentences in that particular way can get repetitive in a rap context. So those were some of the hurdles that Japan had to overcome when it came to how they engaged with rap specifically. Now, the movie Wildstyle is just one of many events that led to hip hop being introduced to Japan. There's a second event I want to discuss, and it has to do with somebody named Hiroshi Fujiwara. Fujiwara is a producer and fashion designer from Japan, and he is oftentimes referred to as the godfather of streetwear culture. Streetwear culture is a bit of a vague term if you aren't familiar with it already, but this will all make sense as the video goes on, I promise. Fujiwara was an aspiring music artist around 1982. He traveled to New York for business, and to make a long story short, he experienced hip-hop for the first time when he went on that trip. When he eventually returned to Japan, he brought back vinyl hip-hop records that he found on his trip, and he started DJing in clubs around Japan, and even wrote about the genre in Japanese news outlets. He pretty much served as an early ambassador for the genre, along with music artist Toshio Nakanishi, who also played a pivotal role, but for the purpose of this video, I want to mainly focus on why Fujiwara is important. Fujiwara would later get deeper into the streetwear and fashion scene after launching his clothing brand called Good Enough, and continue on to become highly influential in shaping the street fashion culture of Ura Harajuku, which is considered the main hub for Tokyo street fashion. So basically, streetwear culture in Japan has a very close relationship with hip-hop, and Hiroshi Fujiwara served as the link between those worlds. So now, let's tie all this history together. We have the movie Wildstyle introducing Japan to graffiti and breakdancing aesthetics, and Hiroshi Fujiwara bringing hip-hop to Japan's streetwear culture. Both of these events pretty much created the lens that Japan sees hip-hop through, and when you look at this history, you have a better understanding of why hip-hop has a very specific vibe and aesthetic when it comes to Japanese games and even anime. It's very different from how America and American games specifically express hip-hop culture. When we circle back to Splatoon specifically, the connection between hip-hop and streetwear culture in Japan becomes very apparent. In one of Nintendo's developer interviews, Splatoon 2 art director Seita Inoue says this about Splatoon's world design. We depict the world based on street culture. The street culture is often derived from what we call counterculture. In other words, it implies some kind of rebellion against the mainstream. As discussed earlier, counterculture movements like hip-hop played a major role in shaping Japan's streetwear scene. And if the historical connections weren't apparent enough, remember the Pharrell hat reference from the Splatoon 2 trailer? The Japanese clothing brand Bape was popularized by Pharrell in America, who has heavy connections with Bape's founder, Nigo. And Nigo was mentored by, guess who? Hiroshi Fujiwara. But this isn't a fashion video. I'm only mentioning this because it wouldn't surprise me to know that Splatoon's development team is very tapped into Japan's streetwear culture, basically. But let's get back to this idea of counterculture in Splatoon and in hip-hop. Now, the director of Splatoon, Nogami, talks about two concepts that inspired the world design: haikara and bankara. He describes haikara as a term that implies an advanced and sophisticated culture from other countries. Specifically, this term was used in Japan at the end of the 19th century to describe Western fashion culture. Splatoon 2's world was created with the concept of haikara in mind. In contrast, Nogami describes the term bankara as something a bit more rough and wild. It intentionally went against the high-collar Western fashion that was starting to circulate in Japan around the 20th century. Bankara was basically the counterculture response to haikara, and Splatoon 3's aesthetic was created around the concept of bankara to represent a shift away from Splatoon 2's fashion trends. So for Japan, streetwear culture is closely linked with this idea of counterculture, and counterculture is closely associated with hip-hop. And you see this connection not only in games like Splatoon, but other Japanese works as well. So let's talk about a couple more, starting with one of my favorites, Samurai Champloo. Samurai Champloo is an anime created by Shinichiro Watanabe, a highly acclaimed director in the anime industry. Samurai Champloo takes place in Edo period Japan and tells the story of Fu, Mugen, Jin, and their random adventures in search of the Sunflower Samurai. But creatively, this show's main claim to fame was that it told this Edo Japan story and combined it with hip-hop sounds and aesthetics. It had a jazzy hip-hop soundtrack composed by legendary producer, fight choreography that oftentimes channeled breakdancing, with Mugen specifically, beatboxing scenes, and even had an episode about graffiti. Watanabe has had a personal connection with hip-hop since high school. He grew up listening to artists like Grandmaster Flash and A Tribe Called Quest, and he wanted to use hip-hop in Samurai Champloo because he saw hip-hop as a symbol of having strong self-identity. He says that samurai have a similar sense of self-identity that rappers do. One of the writers of the show, Dai Sato, talks about why they used hip-hop in Samurai Champloo and said, "People ask me why we portrayed a black culture rather than samurai in Samurai Champloo. And I said that it's a story about a minority culture. Hip-hop is minority culture, and the members of Champloo's were a counterculture or a minority culture in the perspective of that time as well." So once again, with Samurai Champloo, we see Japan using hip-hop as sort of this symbol for counterculture. The show expresses this idea through using hip-hop, a foreign movement that pushed against the mainstream, and contrasting it with traditional conservative Japanese themes from the Edo period. In a way, it's very similar to how Splatoon 2 and 3 contrasted each other with Haikara and Bankara. And the Nujabes produced soundtrack was very reminiscent of golden era boom bap hip hop, a style that was pioneered by artists like Pete Rock and A Tribe Called Quest. And the reason I want to point this out is because Samurai Champloo came out in 2004. And by this time, this style of hip hop was not as prevalent in mainstream American hip hop. And it goes back to the point I was mentioning earlier about how Japan pulls more from this golden era, old school style of hip hop because they're more detached from how hip hop was evolving in America. Now, with that said, I want to get into a few more examples of Japanese games that encapsulate how Japan views hip hop. Jet Set Radio was originally a Dreamcast game developed by Sega. The premise of this game is that you're a part of a crew of roller skating graffiti artists rebelling against the system. The system being the police state and an evil corporation. I don't want to get too deep into the story of it all, but that's the basic gist of it. This game's aesthetic is defined by a breakbeat infused soundtrack by Hideki Naganuma and colorful Wildstyle graffiti art. The vibe actually feels very similar to Splatoon's in some ways, and I wouldn't be surprised if Splatoon's staff took some inspiration from this game. Jet Set Radio continues the trend of showing hip-hop in a countercultural context by having themes of rebelling against society, and also continues the trend of channeling an older boom bap style of hip-hop with the soundtrack and its overall presentation with the heavy emphasis on breakdancing and colorful graffiti. It's Wildstyle with rollerblades, pretty much, and the examples don't stop there. There's Street Fighter 6's recent usage of hip-hop aesthetics, and even the Knuckles tracks on Sonic Adventure 2 have a golden era sound. So the next question then becomes, why does America, the birthplace of hip-hop, approach hip-hop in games so differently from how Japan does it? The big examples we have for hip-hop's usage in American games are things like Grand Theft Auto radio stations, Def Jam Fight for New York, 50 Cent Blood in the Sand, and even that Wu-Tang fighting game from back in the day, I guess. And while some of these games are interesting usages of hip-hop in their own right, the common theme is that these games lean more towards either focusing on a particular artist's brand or just licensing hip-hop music to put in the background. And this isn't a critique necessarily. These games can still be cool in their own right. But when it comes to Western developed games and hip hop, we just don't see as many holistic original worlds in the same way that we do Japanese games. And I have some theories for why that is. For one, hip hop started in America. And by the 2000s, hip hop was fully commercialized in America for the most part, meaning it was no longer the counterculture movement that it originated as. So by the time we got to a point where video games were ready to start utilizing hip hop, it was about how hip hop could be used as a commodity and not about how it could be used to make an artistic statement, because it was now mainstream. On the flip side, Japanese culture was quote unquote behind on hip hop. It didn't reach the mainstream heights that it got to in America yet. Not only because hip hop was a foreign culture that Japan wasn't in close proximity to, but also because certain aspects of hip hop weren't fully compatible with Japanese culture. As I've been pointing out throughout the video, for example, the music aspect of hip hop didn't fully resonate with Japanese culture the same way that the breakdancing and graffiti did. So for the most part, Japan being behind on hip hop meant that they were still viewing it as the countercultural movement that it started as in the 80s, while in America, it was constantly expanding to be this big commercialized industry. So Japan used it in a countercultural way. America uses hip hop in a commercialized way. And you see that through these differences in how hip hop shows up in their video games. And this isn't even to say that one is better than the other. I don't want this to become like a thing Japan video. I don't want this to be that. But I think these differences are interesting to note. So anyway, yeah, Splatoon encapsulates the spirit of Japan's relationship with hip hop, and it's a part of a long lineage of games and other media from Japan that have done the same thing, from Samurai Champloo to Jet Set Radio. There are historical reasons for why hip hop shows up in Japanese works in the way that it does, and I think tracing that history is important. Comment if you have thoughts, support if you like, and subscribe to support. Thanks for watching. It's GK. Peace out.